The certified letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in November, the kind of gray day that makes you want to crawl back under the covers and pretend the world doesn't exist. I was standing in my kitchen in my boxers and an old Steelers t-shirt that had seen better days, the fabric worn thin from too many trips through Martha's ancient washing machine, the one that still sat in our basement making god-awful noises but somehow kept working year after year like everything else in this house that refused to die. I was holding my second cup of coffee, the strong black brew that had become my morning ritual since Martha passed 3 years ago, watching the neighbor's golden retriever take his daily dump on what used to be Martha's prized rose garden. That dog had been doing his business on my property for months now, and his owner, some tech guy who'd moved in last spring with his pregnant wife and their BMW, pretended not to notice when I glared at him through the kitchen window. Martha would have marched over there on day one and given that guy a piece of her mind. She'd have stood on his front porch in her bathrobe and curlers if necessary, hands on her hips, and made it crystal clear that his precious dog could shit anywhere else in the neighborhood except on her roses. But Martha wasn't here anymore, and I'd somehow become the kind of man who stood at his kitchen window fuming silently instead of doing anything about it. That's when I saw the mail truck pulling away from my box, and something made me walk to the front door to collect whatever bills or junk mail had arrived to remind me of everything I couldn't afford or didn't need. The certified letter was tucked between a credit card offer and a flyer for a pizza place that had opened and closed 3 times in the past 5 years. The return address made my coffee taste like ash in my mouth. First National Reverse Mortgage Solutions, Corporate Headquarters, Atlanta, Georgia. My hands started shaking before my brain even caught up to what I was seeing. I hadn't applied for any reverse mortgage. Hell, I'd spent the last 15 years of my life paying down the mortgage on this house in Bethel Park, watching every dollar like it might sprout wings and fly away, skipping vacations Martha had begged for, driving the same beat-up Chevy Silverado until the transmission finally gave up last spring and left me stranded in the Giant Eagle parking lot with a trunk full of melting ice cream. The house was nearly paid off, my one real accomplishment in 54 years of stumbling through life like a drunk man in a darkroom. After 30 years of working double shifts at the Homestead Works before it closed, then another decade at the smaller mill in Braddock before that went under too, after watching my father work himself into an early grave for pennies on the dollar, I'd wanted just one thing in this world that belonged to me free and clear. I tore open the envelope with fingers that felt like sausages, clumsy and thick with panic, scanning the first paragraph twice before the words actually sank into my brain like water into concrete. Congratulations, Mr. Robert Chen. Your reverse mortgage application has been approved for the amount of $187,000 against your property at 1247 Elmwood Drive, Bethel Park, Pennsylvania 1510. The coffee mug slipped from my hand and shattered on the kitchen tile, sending dark liquid splashing across the faded linoleum Martha had insisted on installing 3 years before the cancer took her. She'd spent weeks picking out that pattern, dragging me to Home Depot every Saturday until I thought I'd lose my mind, agonizing over colors and textures like we were decorating the Taj Mahal instead of covering up the 30-year-old vinyl that had started peeling in the corners. But I barely noticed the mess spreading across the floor. I was staring at the signature at the bottom of the attached application, my signature, or what looked like my signature if you squinted and didn't look too close, authorizing someone to essentially steal my house out from under me while I was still breathing. Except I'd never signed a damn thing. The signature was close. I had to give whoever did it credit for that. The way the R in Robert curled back on itself, the sharp downstroke on the C in Chen. They'd studied my handwriting, probably for weeks, practicing until they could forge something that would pass a casual inspection. But I'd been signing my name for 54 years, and I knew every loop and line of it better than I knew the scars on my hands from decades of millwork. This wasn't my signature. My daughter Megan's face flashed through my mind like a neon sign in a dark window, and my stomach dropped like an elevator with a cut cable. She was the only other person who'd been in this house regularly over the past year, the only one who had access to my files, my mail, my life. The same daughter who'd been asking me for money every few months since her divorce from that worthless piece of shit Rob Patterson, who'd walked out on her and the kids to find himself in some ashram in Colorado or some such hippie bullshit. Megan had been struggling to make ends meet with 2 kids and a part-time job at the community college where she taught remedial English to kids who couldn't give a shit about proper grammar or sentence structure. Kids whose parents probably made more in a year than I'd ever seen in my lifetime, but who somehow couldn't be bothered to make sure their children could write a coherent paragraph or spell definitely without using spell check. The same daughter who'd inherited her mother's stubborn streak and her grandfather's pride, who'd rather eat ramen noodles for a month than admit she needed help. Except, apparently, she'd moved past that pride and straight into felony fraud. I stumbled to the living room and collapsed into my recliner, the same brown leather chair I'd bought at a scratch-and-dent sale 15 years ago. The one where I'd watched the Steelers lose to the Patriots in the playoffs last January while eating leftover Chinese food and wondering why Tom Brady couldn't just retire and leave Pittsburgh alone. The same chair where I'd held Martha's hand during her last weeks when the morphine made her sleep 18 hours a day and turned her into a shadow of the woman who'd once threatened to throw my golf clubs in the Monongahela River if I didn't start paying more attention to her than my weekend hobby. The letter was still clutched in my fist, the paper already wrinkled from my death grip, and I forced myself to read it again, hoping I'd somehow misunderstood. But the words were clear as daylight. Approved loan, property collateral, signature verification completed. Someone had walked into a bank or mortgage office, presented themselves as Robert Chen, and convinced a room full of professionals that they had the right to mortgage my house. My phone was on the side table next to a stack of unread newspapers and a coffee-stained copy of last month's AARP magazine, and I grabbed it with trembling fingers, scrolling through my contacts until I found Megan's number. The same number I'd been calling less and less frequently since Martha died, partly because I never knew what to say, and partly because every conversation seemed to end with her asking for money I didn't feel like I could spare. It rang 4 times before going to voicemail, her cheerful voice telling me to leave a message and she'd get back to me soon. That cheerful voice that used to read bedtime stories to my grandkids when they were smaller, that used to call me every Sunday after church just to check in and see how I was managing on my own. Real soon apparently had turned into 3 weeks since our last conversation, and that had been her calling me to ask if I could help with Tommy's soccer registration fees. "Megan, it's Dad. I need you to call me back right now. We need to talk." I hung up and immediately called again. Voicemail. Again. Voicemail. I tried to remember the last time I'd actually seen her in person, not just talked to her on the phone. It had been Halloween, almost 3 weeks ago, when she'd brought the kids by for trick-or-treating. Tommy had been dressed as some kind of superhero I didn't recognize, and Katie had been a princess, both of them excited and sugar-high and talking a mile a minute about their plans for the evening. Megan had looked tired that night, more tired than usual, with dark circles under her eyes and the kind of forced smile that meant she was holding something back. She'd mentioned something about her car making weird noises, about needing to find a cheaper apartment when her lease was up, about wondering if she should look for a second job to make ends meet. I'd offered to look at her car. I might not be a mechanic, but I'd learned enough working on my own vehicles over the years to diagnose basic problems. But she'd waved me off, said she'd figure it out, said she didn't want to be a burden. That word had stuck with me for days afterward, burden. like asking her father for help was some kind of imposition instead of what families were supposed to do for each other. On the fourth try, she picked up. "Dad? Jesus, what's wrong? You've called me like... Did you forge my signature on a reverse mortgage application?" The question came out flat and hard, without any of the careful preamble I'd been planning. No, "How are you doing?" or "We need to discuss something important." Just the raw accusation hanging in the air between us like a challenge. The silence on the other end stretched so long I thought the call had dropped. I could hear noise in the background, kids shouting, a television turned up too loud, the general chaos of a household where too many people were trying to exist in too small a space. When she finally spoke, her voice was small and defensive, the same tone she'd used when I caught her smoking behind the garage when she was 16, the same tone she'd used when I found out she'd been dating Rob Patterson, despite my warnings that the guy was bad news. "Dad, I can explain." "Explain? Explain how you stole my house? Explain how you committed fraud using my name?" I was on my feet now, pacing the living room like a caged animal, my bare feet slapping against the hardwood floors Martha had insisted we installed when Megan started high school. "Jesus Christ, Megan, what were you thinking?" "I was thinking about my kids." Her voice cracked, and I could hear her crying now, the sound muffled like she'd pressed the phone against her shoulder. "I was thinking about how I haven't been able to pay my rent in 3 months, how Katie needs new shoes, and Tommy's been wearing the same winter coat for 2 years because it's the only one I can afford. I was thinking about how I asked you for help and you said you couldn't spare anything because you needed to keep your precious savings account intact." That hit me like a punch to the gut, delivered with surgical precision to the exact spot where my guilt lived. She was right. I had turned her down when she'd asked for a loan back in September. $3,000 to catch up on her rent and get the kids some new clothes for school. $3,000 that represented months of careful budgeting and clipping coupons and buying generic everything, but still just a fraction of what I had sitting in my savings account, earning a pathetic 2% interest. But Christ, it was $3,000, and I'd been saving every penny to pay off the mortgage early, to finally own something free and clear before I died. After 30 years of working in the mills, breathing in steel dust and asbestos and God knows what else, after watching Martha drain our savings fighting cancer, after years of eating store-brand everything and patching clothes instead of buying new ones, I'd wanted just one thing that was truly mine. One thing the bank couldn't take away if I got sick or lost my job or made some stupid financial mistake. One thing I could pass on to Megan and the kids without having to worry about mortgage payments or property taxes or any of the 1,000 ways the world could take it away from them. "So you decided to steal it?" I said, my voice hoarse from shouting. "You decided to take the one thing I have left?" "I wasn't stealing it," she shouted back, and I heard something crash in the background, probably one of the kids knocking something over while she was on the phone, or maybe she'd thrown something in frustration. "Tommy, not now." "Dad, look, the reverse mortgage doesn't mean you lose the house. You can still live there. It just means you get some money now instead of leaving it all to me when you die anyway." "When I die?" I laughed, but there was no humor in it, just the bitter sound of a man who'd suddenly realized his own daughter was planning his funeral. "So you're planning my estate now too? Dividing up my assets before I'm even in the ground?" "That's not what I meant." "That's exactly what you meant." I could feel my blood pressure spiking, the familiar tightness in my chest that came when my temper got the better of my common sense, the way it did when the doctors told me I needed to watch my stress levels or risk another heart incident like the one I'd had last spring. The same heart attack that had landed me in the hospital for a week while Megan sat by my bedside pretending to care about my health while apparently plotting to steal my house. "You forged my signature, Megan. You committed fraud. Do you understand that? Do you understand I could have you arrested?" Another long silence, and when she spoke again, her voice had changed. Gone was the defensive anger, replaced by something cold and calculating that I didn't recognize. Something that reminded me uncomfortably of her mother when Martha had made up her mind about something and wouldn't be swayed by reason or emotion. "You're not going to turn in your own daughter." The certainty in her voice made me angrier than anything else she'd said. Like she knew she could get away with it, because family doesn't do that to family, because I'd always been the soft touch when it came to her and her problems. The same soft touch who'd paid for her college education even though she changed majors 3 times and taken 6 years to graduate. The same soft touch who'd co-signed for her first apartment when Rob couldn't qualify on his own. The same soft touch who'd bailed her out of a dozen smaller financial crises over the years, because that's what fathers do for their daughters. "Watch me," I said, and hung up. But even as I said it, even as I jabbed the end call button with enough force to crack the screen, I knew she was probably right. Family was family, and you didn't send your own blood to prison no matter what they'd done to you. That was the code I'd been raised on, the same code my father had lived by when his brother had nearly bankrupted the family business with his gambling debts, the same code that had kept our family together through decades of hardship and disappointment. But knowing she was right didn't make me any less angry. 24 hours later, I was sitting in the cramped office of Janet Morrison, the only lawyer in Bethel Park who specialized in elder fraud, watching her review the documents I'd brought in a manila folder that had seen better days. The folder was left over from my mill days, when I'd been a union representative and had to keep track of grievance files and contract negotiations. Now it held the evidence of my daughter's betrayal. Janet's office was exactly what you'd expect from a small-town lawyer who dealt with old people's problems: mismatched furniture, faded diplomas on wood-paneled walls, and the kind of industrial carpeting that had probably been installed sometime during the Carter administration. But Janet herself commanded respect. She was probably 60 herself, with steel-gray hair pulled back in a practical bun, and the no-nonsense demeanor of someone who'd spent decades dealing with people's messiest, most complicated problems. "This is a clear case of forgery," Janet said, adjusting her reading glasses as she compared the signature on the reverse mortgage application to examples of my real signature I'd brought along. She'd asked me to bring samples of my authentic signature from various documents, bank statements, tax returns, insurance papers, and now she was studying them with the intensity of an art expert examining a potential masterpiece. "The question is whether you want to pursue criminal charges against your daughter." "I don't know," I admitted, slumping in the uncomfortable plastic chair across from her desk. The chair was the kind you'd find in a doctor's waiting room or a DMV office, designed to be functional rather than comfortable, a reminder that this wasn't a social visit. "I just want my house back. I want this whole thing to go away." Unfortunately, it's not that simple. Janet pulled out a yellow legal pad and started making notes in the kind of precise handwriting that suggested she'd been doing this for a long time. "The reverse mortgage company has already processed the application and approved the loan. They've acted in good faith based on what appeared to be legitimate documents. To reverse this, we'll need to prove fraud, which means involving law enforcement. What if I just paid them back, all of it?" Janet looked up from her notes with the kind of expression I'd seen on Martha's face when she was trying to tell me bad news without crushing my spirit entirely. "Do you have $187,000 lying around?" I almost laughed at the absurdity of it. If I'd had that kind of money, Megan wouldn't have been desperate enough to forge my signature in the first place. If I'd had that kind of money, I could have helped her with the rent and the kids' clothes and whatever other financial disasters were eating away at her peace of mind. If I'd had that kind of money, none of this would have happened. No. I've got maybe 15 grand in savings. The admission tasted like failure in my mouth. $15,000 that represented years of careful planning and sacrifice, and it wasn't even enough to put a dent in the problem my daughter had created. "Then we need to prove fraud." She leaned back in her chair, studying me with the kind of professional assessment that made me feel like a specimen under a microscope. I have to ask, Mr. Chen, did you give your daughter permission to handle any of your financial affairs? Did you ever sign any power of attorney documents? Any advance directives that might have given her legal authority to act on your behalf? No, nothing like that. I'd been through this conversation in my head a dozen times since getting the letter, trying to figure out if there was any possible way this could be a misunderstanding, any legitimate explanation for how my signature had ended up on documents I'd never seen. She had a key to the house, sure. She'd come by to check on me sometimes, help with groceries when I was having trouble getting around after my heart attack, but I never gave her permission to sign anything. How would she have gotten access to your personal information? Social security number, income documents, bank statements, that sort of thing. I thought about it, my stomach churning with the implications. My desk. I keep everything in the desk in my bedroom. Tax returns, bank statements, insurance papers, all of it. She would have known where to look. The desk was an old roll top that had belonged to my father. Solid oak that weighed about as much as a small car. My mother had wanted to get rid of it after Dad died, said it was too big and too old-fashioned for modern life. But I insisted on keeping it, had paid to have it moved from their house to ours, had spent weekends refinishing it until the wood gleamed like honey in the bedroom lamplight. It was where I'd paid bills for 30 years, where I'd balanced checkbooks and filed tax returns and kept track of all the mundane financial details that kept a household running. It was also where I'd kept Martha's medical records during her last illness, where I'd organized insurance claims and prescription receipts and the endless paperwork that accompanies dying in America. And it was where Megan would have found everything she needed to steal my identity and mortgage my house. Janet nodded grimly, making more notes on her legal pad. We'll need to document all of that. But first, I'm going to recommend we hire a handwriting expert to analyze the signature. If we can prove conclusively that it's forged, it strengthens our case significantly. How much is this going to cost? I asked, though I was afraid to hear the answer. Everything in my life seemed to come down to money these days. How much I had, how much I needed, how much I could afford to spend on problems I'd never asked for. The handwriting analysis will run about $1,500. My fees, she paused, clearly doing math in her head, calculating how much justice was going to cost an old man who'd already been robbed by his own daughter. This could get expensive, Mr. Chen. We're talking about potentially several $1,000s just to get started, and if it goes to trial, the costs could escalate quickly. I felt like I was drowning in quicksand, every movement making my situation worse. The money I'd saved over decades, the nest egg I'd built by denying myself every small luxury and pleasure, was about to disappear into lawyers' fees while I fought to get back what should have been mine in the first place. It was like being mugged twice, once by my daughter and once by the legal system that was supposed to protect me. There's something else you need to consider, Janet continued, her voice taking on the careful tone lawyers use when they're about to deliver news that will change your life. If we pursue this and prove fraud, your daughter could face serious criminal charges. We're talking about felony fraud, potentially federal charges, since this involves a federally regulated financial institution. She could go to prison for several years. Prison. The word hung in the air between us like smoke from a house fire, acrid and suffocating. I thought about Megan's kids, Tommy and Katie, 8 and 10 years old, still young enough to believe their mother was a hero who could fix any hurt and make any hurt better. I thought about them visiting their mother behind bars, growing up with the stigma of having a convicted felon for a parent, answering questions from classmates and teachers about why mommy lived in a place with razor wire and locked doors. But I also thought about Martha, about the promise I'd made to her before she died. We'd been sitting in this same living room, her head wrapped in a colorful scarf that couldn't quite hide how thin her hair had become, her hand in mine feeling fragile as bird bones. "Take care of yourself, Bobby," she'd whispered during one of her last lucid moments.
her voice barely audible over the hum of the oxygen concentrator. "Don't let anyone take advantage of your good heart. Promise me you won't let people walk all over you just because I'm not here to protect you." She'd known me too well, had seen how I'd always been a sucker for a sob story, how I'd give away my last dollar to help someone in need.
She'd watched me lend money to friends who never paid it back, watched me volunteer for overtime shifts to help coworkers who were struggling, watched me say yes when I should have said no more times than she could count. "Let's start with the handwriting expert," I said finally, making a decision that felt like stepping off a cliff, one step at a time. Janet reached for her phone, flipping through a well-worn address book that looked like it had survived several decades of use. "I know someone good, Dr. Sarah Chen, no relation I assume. She's testified in federal court dozens of times. Very credible, very thorough. If there's fraud here, she'll be able to prove it." 3 days later, I was sitting across from Dr. Chen in her downtown Pittsburgh office, watching her examine my signatures under a high-powered magnifying glass attached to some kind of fancy camera system that probably cost more than my truck. The office was modern and sterile, all chrome and glass and intimidating technology that made me feel like I'd wandered into a science fiction movie. Dr. Chen herself was younger than I'd expected, maybe 40, with a kind of intense focus that reminded me of the quality control engineers back at the mill, people who could spot defects invisible to the naked eye, who could tell you exactly what had gone wrong in a process just by looking at the end result. She wore wire-rimmed glasses and had her dark hair pulled back in a professional ponytail, and she studied my signatures with the concentration of a surgeon performing a delicate operation. "The pressure patterns are completely different," she was saying, pointing to enlarged images of the signatures displayed on her computer screen. "The technology was impressive. She could zoom in so close I could see individual pen strokes, could analyze the way the ink had soaked into the paper, could measure angles and curves with mathematical precision. Look here, your authentic signature shows consistent pressure throughout the stroke, a natural flow that comes from muscle memory developed over decades of repetition." She clicked to another image, this one showing the forged signature from the reverse mortgage application. The forged signature has hesitation marks, areas where the pen was lifted and repositioned. You can see here where they stopped and started again, trying to get the curve of the R just right. Someone was copying your signature very carefully, probably tracing it multiple times to practice. "So you can prove it's fake?" "Absolutely. This is textbook forgery, and not even particularly sophisticated forgery." She turned to face me, her expression serious but confident. "Whoever did this had access to examples of your real signature, probably multiple examples, given how close they got to replicating the basic shape. But they couldn't replicate the natural flow and pressure variations of your actual handwriting." She pulled up another set of images, showing my signature from various documents side by side. "See how your authentic signatures vary slightly from document to document. That's normal. No one signs their name exactly the same way every time. But there are consistent patterns in pressure, speed, and pen angle that are virtually impossible to fake convincingly." I stared at the screen, seeing my own handwriting transformed into evidence of my daughter's crime. "This is going to hold up in court, Mr. Chen. The question is whether you want to take it that far." That afternoon, I drove to Megan's apartment complex in Castle Shannon, a cluster of run-down buildings that had seen better days sometime in the 70s, when they'd probably been considered modern and desirable. Now they looked like what they were: cheap housing for people who couldn't afford anything better, maintained just well enough to pass inspection and collect rent. The parking lot was cracked and potholed, filled with cars that had seen better decades. Megan's Honda Civic was parked in front of Building C, and I could see rust eating away at the wheel wells and a spiderweb crack in the rear window that had been there for months. The same car she'd been complaining about making weird noises, the same car she couldn't afford to fix or replace. Her unit was on the second floor, and I could hear the kids arguing about something before I even climbed the stairs. Their voices carried through the thin walls, along with the sounds of televisions and conversations from neighboring apartments. The hallway smelled like cooking grease and industrial carpet cleaner, with an undertone of something I couldn't identify but didn't want to think about too hard. I knocked on the door and waited, hearing footsteps and muffled conversation before the locks turned. Multiple locks, I noticed. The kind of security measures you needed when you lived in a neighborhood where break-ins were a real possibility. Megan answered wearing yoga pants and an oversized University of Pittsburgh sweatshirt that I'd bought her when she'd started her master's degree, back when we'd all thought she was going to become a professor, before life got in the way and dreams got downsized to part-time teaching gigs and struggling to make rent. The sweatshirt was faded now, with a small hole near the left shoulder, but she still wore it like armor against the world. "Dad," she looked surprised, then wary, her eyes darting past me to see if I'd brought anyone with me. "I wasn't expecting you. We need to talk." She glanced back into the apartment, where I could see Tommy sprawled on the couch playing some kind of video game on a TV that was too big for the space, probably bought during better times, when Rob still lived there and contributed to the household income. Katie was at the kitchen table, bent over what looked like homework, surrounded by colored pencils and construction paper.
"Kids, go to your rooms for a few minutes," Megan called, her voice carrying the kind of forced cheerfulness parents use when they're trying not to alarm their children. "Mommy needs to talk to Grandpa about grown-up stuff." Tommy started to protest. He was at that age where he thought he should be included in adult conversations, where he resented being treated like a child. But something in Megan's tone must have convinced him this wasn't the time to argue. They disappeared down the hallway, and I heard bedroom doors closing with the exaggerated loudness that meant they were making a point about being excluded. Megan gestured for me to sit at the kitchen table, the same table where Katie had been doing her homework. I could see her assignment, a worksheet about fractions that reminded me of helping Megan with similar problems when she was that age, back when math was simple and the biggest problem in our lives was making sure she understood how to reduce fractions to their lowest terms. The apartment was small but clean, decorated with the kind of mismatched furniture that comes from thrift stores and hand-me-downs and yard sales where you buy whatever you can afford rather than what you actually want. But Megan had done her best to make it feel like home. Family photos on the refrigerator, kids' artwork taped to the walls, a few of Martha's old decorative items scattered around to add warmth to the space. I could see Martha's old mixing bowls stacked in the dish drainer, the ceramic ones with the blue flowers that had been wedding gifts 40 years ago. Megan had asked for them after the funeral, and I'd been glad to see them go to someone who would actually use them. Martha would have liked knowing her granddaughter was using the same bowls she'd used to make cookies and birthday cakes and Sunday morning pancakes. "I hired a handwriting expert," I said, without preamble, skipping past any pretense of small talk or family pleasantries. "She can prove you forged my signature." Megan's face went pale, the color draining out of her cheeks like water out of a broken dam. But she didn't deny it, didn't try to act surprised or confused or wrongly accused. She just sat down across from me and stared at her hands folded on the table. "Dad, I also hired a lawyer. She says you're looking at felony charges, possibly federal charges." "Federal?" Megan's voice was barely a whisper, the word coming out like she was testing its weight, trying to understand what it meant for her life and her children's future. "Fraud against a federally regulated financial institution. That's serious, Megan. That's real prison time. That's your kids growing up without their mother while you sit in a cell somewhere thinking about how you destroyed your family over money." She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with sobs that she was trying to muffle so the kids wouldn't hear. When she looked up, her eyes were red and desperate, filled with the kind of panic that comes when you realize you've made a mistake so big there might not be any way to fix it. "I never meant for it to go this far. I was so scared, Dad. The landlord was threatening to evict us next week if I didn't catch up on the rent. Katie needed to see a doctor for her asthma. She's been having attacks and her inhaler isn't working right. But I couldn't afford the copay for a specialist. I was working 3 jobs and still couldn't make ends meet." 3 jobs? I hadn't known about the 3rd job, hadn't realized things had gotten that desperate. What 3 jobs? The college, the cleaning service, and I've been doing online tutoring at night after the kids go to bed, sometimes until 2 or 3 in the morning, trying to help high school kids with their English papers. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, leaving mascara smears that made her look younger and more vulnerable. Do you know what I make per hour tutoring? $12. $12 to help some rich kid in California write an essay about the Great Gatsby so he can get into Stanford. I thought about my own high school years, when $12 an hour would have seemed like a fortune, when I'd worked summers at the mill for minimum wage and felt grateful for the opportunity. But that was a different world, a different economy, a time when you could support a family on one income and still have enough left over for a vacation to Ocean City every summer. So you stole from me. I borrowed from you, she shot back, anger flashing through the tears like lightning through storm clouds. That's what I told myself. I was going to pay it back somehow. I thought maybe I could get a better job, or maybe you'd understand once you saw how much we needed it, how desperate things had gotten. By committing fraud? By doing what I had to do to keep my kids fed and housed. She was crying openly now, not bothering to wipe away the tears or lower her voice. Do you know what it's like to watch your children go without things? To see them wearing clothes that don't fit because you can't afford new ones? To lie awake at night wondering if you're going to lose your apartment and end up homeless? I did know, actually. I'd lived through plenty of lean times when Megan was growing up, when the mill was cutting shifts and laying off workers, when Martha was pregnant with the baby we lost in the 6th month and couldn't work. I remembered nights when we'd eaten beans and rice for dinner 3 times in 1 week, when we'd turned the heat down to 60 degrees to save money on the gas bill, when I'd walked to work instead of driving to save gas money. But I'd never resorted to stealing from family. I'd worked extra shifts, taken odd jobs, sold things I didn't really want to sell. But I'd never looked at my own father and seen a target instead of family.
My mother and I went through hard times too, I said quietly. We never stole from anyone. You had each other. Megan's voice cracked with exhaustion and desperation. You had Mom to help carry the load, to share the decisions and the worry and the responsibility. I'm doing this alone, Dad. Every decision, every bill, every crisis, it's all on me. Tommy gets in trouble at school, it's my fault for not supervising him better. Katie gets sick, it's my fault for not taking her to the doctor sooner. The car breaks down, the rent goes up, the kids need new shoes, it's all on me, and I'm drowning. I looked around the apartment again, really seeing it this time, instead of just cataloging its deficiencies. The carpet was worn thin in places, especially in front of the couch where the kids would sit to watch TV. The windows needed new caulking, and I could feel cold air seeping in despite the space heater humming in the corner. There was a water stain on the ceiling above the kitchen table that suggested roof problems the landlord probably wasn't going to fix anytime soon. But there were also signs of a woman trying to make the best of a bad situation. A small herb garden on the windowsill, growing basil and oregano in recycled yogurt containers. School artwork proudly displayed on the refrigerator with colorful magnets. A bookshelf made from cinder blocks and boards, filled with children's books and worn paperbacks that had probably come from library sales. This wasn't the life I'd wanted for my daughter. When she was born, when I'd held her for the first time in the hospital and promised Martha and God and myself that I'd give this little girl everything I'd never had, I'd imagined something different. I'd imagined a house with a yard where grandchildren could play. Imagined family dinners around a table that didn't wobble. Imagined a life where money wasn't the first thing you thought about when you woke up and the last thing you worried about before you went to sleep. Why didn't you come to me? I asked, though I was afraid I already knew the answer. Really come to me, I mean. Sit me down and explain how bad things were. Show me the eviction notice and the medical bills and all of it. Megan laughed bitterly.
a sound that reminded me of breaking glass. Because you would have said no. You always say no, Dad. You've been saying no since Mom died. No to helping with the kids' school expenses when the list of supplies got longer every year. No to helping with my car payment when I got behind during Tommy's bout with pneumonia. No to everything because you're too busy protecting your precious savings account. That stung because it was partially true, maybe more than partially. I had been protective of my money since Martha died, maybe too protectively.
But after watching our life savings disappear into medical bills and funeral costs, after seeing how quickly financial security could evaporate when life decided to kick you in the teeth, I'd been terrified of ending up with nothing. I'd seen too many men my age who'd been generous with their money when they were younger, who'd helped everyone who asked and never said no to family, who'd ended up broke and dependent in their old age. I'd sworn I wouldn't be one of them, wouldn't burden my daughter with an impoverished father who needed financial help just to survive. But in trying to avoid being a burden, I'd apparently pushed my daughter into becoming a criminal. I was scared, I admitted, the words coming out harder than I'd expected. After your mother's medical bills, after seeing how fast everything can disappear when someone gets really sick, I was scared of ending up broke and helpless. And I was scared of my kids being homeless, Megan shot back. So I guess we were both scared of the wrong things. We sat in silence for a few minutes, the weight of decades of miscommunication and missed opportunities settling between us like dust. From down the hall, I could hear the kids whispering to each other, probably wondering why Grandpa was making Mommy cry, probably trying to figure out if this was the kind of grown-up conversation that meant their world was about to change again. The handwriting expert says she can testify in court, I said finally, breaking the silence with facts that felt like stones in my mouth. My lawyer says with her testimony, we can definitely prove fraud. The reverse mortgage company will have to void the loan. Megan nodded, not looking at me, her fingers tracing patterns on the table like she was trying to memorize the wood grain. So what happens now? You call the police? I don't know, and I really didn't. Part of me wanted justice, wanted her to face consequences for what she'd done, wanted her to understand that actions have results, and you can't just steal from people because you're desperate. But part of me just wanted my house back and my life to return to something resembling normal, wanted to pretend this had never happened and go back to watching baseball games and complaining about the neighbor's dog. The lawyer says if we prove fraud, the reverse mortgage company will have to void the loan. But that means criminal charges against you. That means prison time. How long would I go to prison? She wasn't sure. Could be a few years, could be longer, depending on how the federal prosecutors decide to handle it. Megan closed her eyes, and when she opened them again, she looked older somehow, worn down by the weight of what she'd done and what it might cost her. The kids would go into foster care. Rob sure as hell isn't going to take them. He can barely manage his own life, living in some commune in Colorado with his new girlfriend who thinks crystals can cure cancer. I thought about Tommy and Katie, about them being placed with strangers while their mother served time for a crime she'd committed out of desperation. Foster care meant strange houses and unfamiliar rules, meant caseworkers and court hearings and the kind of bureaucratic nightmare that could scar children for life. It meant my grandchildren growing up thinking their family had abandoned them, thinking they weren't worth fighting for. But it also meant justice. It meant consequences for fraud and theft and the violation of trust that had shattered something fundamental between us. There might be another way, I heard myself saying, though I wasn't sure where the words were coming from. The idea was forming as I spoke, probably a terrible idea, but an idea nonetheless. What if you paid it back?
Dad, I don't have $187,000. I don't have $187 in my checking account right now. What if I helped you pay it back? She stared at me like I'd lost my mind, like I'd started speaking a foreign language or claimed the moon was made of green cheese. You just said you only have $15,000 in savings. I could refinance the house, take out a legitimate mortgage, use the money to pay off the reverse mortgage. The idea was gaining momentum in my head, each piece falling into place like dominoes. Then you could make payments to me instead of to some corporation in Atlanta. We could work out a payment plan, something manageable. Dad, that's crazy. You'd be putting yourself in debt to save me from going to prison. Maybe. Or maybe I'd be putting myself in debt to keep my grandchildren from growing up without their mother. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the parking lot where kids were riding bikes between the potholes, their laughter echoing off the brick walls. Maybe I'd be doing what your mother would have wanted me to do. Megan was quiet for a long time, staring at her hands folded on the table. I could hear the apartment settling around us, the sounds of other families living their lives behind thin walls, televisions playing, children arguing, adults trying to hold their worlds together one day at a time. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. Why would you do that? After what I did to you? It was a good question, and I wasn't sure I had a good answer. Maybe it was because Martha would have found a way to help, would have figured out how to keep the family together no matter what the cost. Maybe it was because I was tired of being angry, tired of protecting my money while my family fell apart around me. Or maybe it was just because sometimes doing the right thing doesn't make sense on paper, doesn't balance out in a ledger or follow the rules of sound financial planning. Because you're my daughter, I said simply, and because those kids don't deserve to pay for your mistakes.
But even as I said it, I knew it was more complicated than that. It was about guilt. The guilt of turning her down when she'd asked for help. The guilt of not seeing how desperate she'd become. The guilt of being so focused on protecting my own financial security that I'd lost sight of what family was supposed to mean. It was about Martha, too. About the woman who'd made me promise to take care of myself, but who'd spent her life taking care of everyone else. She'd never turned away a neighbor in need, never said no when the church asked for volunteers, never met a stray animal or lost soul she couldn't find room for in her heart. And it was about the man I wanted to be versus the man I'd become. Somewhere along the way, sometime after Martha died and the world became a scarier, more uncertain place, I'd forgotten that money was supposed to be a tool, not a goal. I'd forgotten that the point of saving for the future was to have something to give to the people you loved, not to hoard it like a dragon sitting on a pile of gold. There would have to be conditions, I said, turning back to face her. This isn't just forgiveness. This is a business arrangement. You'd sign a legal agreement to pay back every penny, with interest. You'd get a second job if you had to. You'd sell whatever you needed to sell. And if you ever did anything like this again, if you ever lied to me or stole from me or anyone else, the deal is off and I pursue criminal charges. Megan nodded eagerly, tears streaming down her face. Yes, anything. I'll do whatever it takes. And the kids would know. Not the details, but they'd know their mother made a serious mistake and is working to make it right. They need to understand that actions have consequences, even when families forgive each other. I understand. 2 weeks later, I was back in Janet Morrison's office, but this time Megan was with me, sitting in the same uncomfortable plastic chair where I'd first learned the true scope of what she'd done to our family. The handwriting analysis report was sitting on Janet's desk like evidence in a murder trial, 40 pages of technical analysis and enlarged photographs that proved beyond any reasonable doubt that my signature had been forged. But instead of discussing criminal charges and prison sentences, we were talking about restitution agreements and payment plans. This is highly unusual, Janet said for the third time since we'd started the meeting. Usually, when we have this level of evidence of fraud, when the case is this clear-cut, we pursue criminal charges through the district attorney's office.
But we can do it this way? I asked. We can use the handwriting analysis to prove fraud to the reverse mortgage company, get them to void the loan, and then handle the restitution privately. Technically, yes. If you refuse to cooperate with criminal prosecution, and if your daughter agrees to sign a comprehensive restitution agreement for the full amount. Janet shuffled through papers, shaking her head like she still couldn't believe what we were proposing. I have to advise you that this could be seen as enabling criminal behavior. Some would argue that you're allowing your daughter to escape the consequences of her actions. I'm not enabling anything, I said firmly. I'm holding her accountable. She's going to pay back every penny with interest. It's just going to be me she pays it back to instead of the state of Pennsylvania. Megan hadn't said much during the meeting, but she spoke up now. I've already started looking for a second job, and I'm going to sell anything I can. Furniture, jewelry, whatever has any value. I want to pay this back as fast as possible. She'd lost weight since our conversation at her apartment, the stress of the situation carving hollows under her cheekbones and making her clothes hang loose on her frame. But there was something different in her posture, too, something that suggested she'd accepted the magnitude of what she'd done and was ready to face whatever it took to make things right. Janet looked at both of us like we were speaking a foreign language, like we'd wandered into her office from some alternate universe where families handled criminal fraud with handshake deals and payment plans. Mr. Chen, you understand that by refinancing your house to pay off this reverse mortgage, you're essentially starting over on 30 years of mortgage payments. At your age, you'll be making house payments until you're in your 80s, assuming you live that long. I understand. The math was brutal. I'd be 84 when the mortgage was finally paid off, assuming I made it that long and assuming I never missed a payment. It meant giving up any dreams of a comfortable retirement, meant working until I dropped, or accepting a standard of living that would make my current penny pinching look luxurious by comparison. And, Miss Patterson, you understand that this restitution agreement is legally binding. If you default on payments, if you miss more than 2 consecutive months, your father can pursue both civil and criminal remedies. This isn't a family loan that you can renegotiate over Thanksgiving dinner. This is a legal contract with serious consequences for default. I understand, Megan said quietly. Janet sighed and reached for a fresh legal pad, her movements suggesting this wasn't the first time she'd seen families make decisions that defied logic and common sense. All right then, let's draw up the paperwork, but I want both of you to understand that this is irreversible. Once we present this evidence to the reverse mortgage company and they void the loan, once Mr. Chen refinances his house to cover the amount, there's no going back. This becomes your reality for the next several decades. The next few months passed in a blur of paperwork, phone calls, and tense meetings with bank representatives who couldn't quite believe what they were seeing. The handwriting analysis was exactly what we needed. Dr. Chen's report was so thorough and damning that the reverse mortgage company agreed to void the loan without much argument. Nobody wanted to be on the hook for processing fraudulent documents, especially when we had such clear evidence of forgery. Getting a new mortgage at 54 wasn't easy, especially when the loan officers realized I was essentially refinancing my house to pay off fraud committed by my own daughter. There were raised eyebrows and whispered conversations, and more than one suggestion that I might want to reconsider my decision. But my credit was good, I had steady income from my pension and Social Security, and I was putting up the house itself as collateral. The payments were going to be tight, $1,247 a month for the next 30 years, money that would have to come out of my fixed income whether I was healthy or sick, employed or unemployed, alone or surrounded by family. But they were manageable if I was careful, if I gave up any pretense of living comfortably and focused on pure survival. More carefully than I'd been living before, which was saying something. Megan found a night job cleaning offices downtown, which meant she was working from 6 in the morning until noon at the community college, then from 8 at night until midnight scrubbing floors and emptying trash cans in glass towers filled with people who made more in a week than she made in a year. She looked exhausted all the time, moving through her days like a zombie, but she never complained. Every 2 weeks, like clockwork, she brought me a payment, usually around $400, sometimes more if she'd picked up extra shifts or sold something of value. The kids stayed with me on the nights she worked late, sleeping in the guest room that used to be Megan's when she was growing up. The room still had her old furniture, a twin bed with a pink comforter that was faded but clean, a desk where she'd done homework and written in diaries and dreamed about her future. Now it was where my grandchildren slept when their mother was downtown mopping floors and cleaning toilets to pay for her mistakes. Tommy helped me figure out how to use the smart TV Megan had bought me for Christmas a few years back, patiently explaining the remote control and showing me how to find baseball games and old movies. Katie taught me to play some card games she'd learned at school, a complicated thing involving strategy and luck that reminded me of poker, but with princesses instead of face cards. They didn't know the details of what had happened, just that Mommy was working extra hard to pay Grandpa back for some money she'd borrowed. But they were smart kids, and I could see them putting pieces together, asking questions that didn't have easy answers. "Why does Mommy cry sometimes when she thinks we're not looking?" Katie asked one evening while we were making dinner together.
Adults cry sometimes when they're worried about things, I told her, which was true enough without being the whole truth. Is it because of money? Kids always know more than you think they do. Sometimes grown-ups make mistakes about money, and then they have to work very hard to fix those mistakes. Did Mommy make a mistake? I looked at this 10-year-old girl who had her mother's eyes and her grandmother's stubborn chin, and I wondered how much truth she could handle. Yes, sweetheart, she made a mistake, but she's working very hard to make it right, and that's what matters. 6 months into our arrangement, I was sitting at my kitchen table paying bills when Megan knocked on the back door. She had her own key. I'd never asked for it back, couldn't bring myself to take away that small symbol of trust, even after everything that had happened. But she'd started knocking instead of just walking in, some kind of penance that probably hurt her more than it hurt me. "I brought this month's payment," she said, setting an envelope on the table, "plus a little extra." I opened the envelope and counted $500, more than her usual payment. Where'd the extra come from? "I sold Mom's jewelry box, the one she left me." Megan's voice was matter-of-fact, but I could see the pain in her eyes, the knowledge that she was selling off pieces of her mother's memory to pay for her own mistakes. "Got $200 for it at the antique store on Washington Road." The jewelry box had been Martha's grandmother's, a beautiful mahogany piece with tiny drawers and hidden compartments, lined with faded velvet that still smelled faintly of the perfume Martha had worn. She'd treasured that box, had spent hours as a child playing with it, learning the secrets of its construction, understanding that it was something precious that connected her to generations of women who'd come before. "Megan, you didn't have to." "Yes, I did." She sat down across from me, looking older than her 32 years. The stress of working 2 jobs and caring for 2 children and carrying the weight of what she'd done had aged her in ways that went beyond simple exhaustion. "I've been thinking a lot about what Mom would say about all this, about what I did, about how you're handling it." I'd been thinking about Martha a lot too, especially during the long nights when I couldn't sleep and found myself wandering through the house we'd shared for 30 years. Wondering if I was doing right by her memory, or just being a fool. Wondering if she'd be proud of my decision to help Megan, or disappointed that I'd let myself be taken advantage of. What do you think she'd say? I think she'd be ashamed of me for what I did, but I think she'd be proud of you for how you're dealing with it. Megan wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, leaving faint mascara smears that reminded me of when she was a teenager, coming home from dates and trying to repair her makeup before I noticed she'd been crying. "She always said you had a good heart, even when it got you in trouble." "She said that? All the time. She used to worry that people would take advantage of you after she was gone, that you'd give away everything trying to help people who didn't deserve it." I laughed, but there wasn't much humor in it. "Sounds like she was right." "No, Dad, she was wrong." Megan leaned forward, her expression intense in a way that reminded me of Martha when she was trying to make an important point. I didn't deserve your help. What I did was unforgivable. But you helped me anyway, and that doesn't make you a fool. It makes you a good father. We sat quietly for a few minutes, the kitchen filled with the familiar sounds of the old house settling around us, the creak of floorboards, the hum of the refrigerator, the distant sound of children playing in the street outside. I thought about Martha, about the promises I'd made to her and the promises I'd made to myself, about the difference between being taken advantage of and choosing to help someone who desperately needed it. "I've been thinking about something," I said finally. "When this is all paid off, when you've made things right, maybe we could talk about you and the kids moving back home. There's plenty of room here, and it would save you rent money, help you get back on your feet." Megan's eyes filled with tears, and for a moment she looked like the little girl who used to crawl into my lap when she was scared or hurt or just needed comfort. "Dad, I can't ask you to." "You're not asking. I'm offering." I looked around the kitchen, at the empty chairs where Martha used to sit, at the two quiet spaces that had echoed with loneliness for the past 3 years. This house is too big for one person, and those kids, they should know where their family comes from. They should have a grandfather who's part of their daily lives, not just someone they visit when their mother has time to drive across town. The idea had been forming in my mind for weeks, growing stronger every time the kids stayed overnight, every time I watched them help with dinner, or saw Katie curl up in Martha's old reading chair with a book. The house had been designed for a family, had been built to hold the sounds of children and the chaos of daily life. Without that, it was just an expensive box filled with memories. "Are you sure? Because once we move in, once the kids get settled and start thinking of this as home, it'll be hard to undo that if you change your mind." I thought about it, really thought about it. About mortgage payments I'd be making for the next 25 years, about the money I'd never get back, about the trust that had been broken and was slowly being rebuilt, about second chances and family obligations, and the difference between being right and being wise, about what Martha would have wanted, what she would have done if our positions had been reversed. "I'm sure," I said. That night, after Megan left to pick up the kids from her babysitter, I sat in my recliner with a beer and Martha's photo on the side table. The same photo that had been there for 3 years, the one where she was laughing at something I'd said during our last anniversary dinner. Back when we'd still believed the doctors who said the treatment was working. Back when we'd still made plans for a future that would never come. "I think I did the right thing," I told her picture, the way I'd been talking to her photo every night since she died. "I think you would have done the same thing, probably would have figured it out faster than I did." The house was quiet around me, but it didn't feel as empty as it had for months. Tomorrow, Megan would bring another payment, and we'd be a little closer to making things right. The kids would come over for dinner on Sunday, and Tommy would beat me at that video game again while Katie helped me make pancakes the way Martha used to make them, with extra vanilla and a pinch of cinnamon that made the whole kitchen smell like happiness. It wasn't the life I'd planned when I was 54 and looking forward to a debt-free retirement filled with fishing trips and baseball games and maybe a cruise or two with whatever woman might be willing to put up with an old steelworker's rough edges. But it was the life I had, and maybe that was enough. Maybe, sometimes, doing the right thing meant letting go of the future you'd imagined and embracing the family you'd been given, even when they made mistakes that nearly cost everyone everything. I raised my beer in a toast to Martha's photograph and settled back in my chair to watch the Pirates lose another game. Outside, the November wind rattled the windows and sent dead leaves skittering across the yard, but inside, the house felt warm and full of possibility. 3 years later, the kitchen table was cluttered with homework assignments and art projects, and the sounds of children's laughter echoed through rooms that had been silent too long.
Megan had made her final payment 2 months early, working herself nearly to exhaustion to clear the debt and prove to both of us that she was serious about making things right. The handwriting expert's report was filed away in my desk drawer, along with all the other paperwork from those terrible months when our family nearly fell apart over money and pride and the desperate choices people make when they're backed into corners with no way out. Sometimes I took it out and looked at it, remembering how close we'd come to losing everything that mattered. But mostly, I just listened to my grandchildren argue about whose turn it was to feed Charlie, a scraggly mutt Megan had rescued from the animal shelter as a way to teach the kids about responsibility.
The same kids who now came home to a house instead of an apartment, who had a grandfather who helped with homework and taught them to change oil in the driveway, who were growing up knowing that family meant something even when people made mistakes. Megan had a new job now, teaching full-time at a different community college where they appreciated her dedication and offered actual benefits. She'd finished paying me back, but she'd also started a college fund for the kids, putting away $50 every month toward their future education. It wasn't much, but it was a start, a way of ensuring they'd have opportunities she'd never had. The mortgage would be paid off when I was 79, assuming I lived that long, and assuming my body held up for another 25 years of monthly payments. But the house was full again, alive with the sounds of family, and that seemed like a pretty good trade. Tommy was in high school now, playing varsity baseball and dating a girl who seemed to have her head screwed on straight. Katie was 13 and had discovered a talent for writing that reminded me of her mother at that age, filling notebooks with stories and poems that made me believe the world might be in better hands than I'd thought. And Megan? Megan had grown into the woman I'd always hoped she'd become. Still stubborn, still proud, but tempered by experience and hardship in ways that had made her stronger rather than bitter. She'd learned to ask for help when she needed it, learned to accept that family meant sharing burdens as well as joys. "You know what Mom would say about all this?" she asked one evening while we were cleaning up after Sunday dinner, the kids upstairs arguing about something trivial and Charlie asleep under the table. "What's that?" "She'd say you turned out exactly the way she knew you would. Stubborn and generous and too damn good for your own good." I thought about that while I finished loading the dishwasher, thought about the woman who'd known me better than I knew myself, who'd seen past my rough edges to whatever decent qualities might have been hiding underneath, who'd believed I was capable of being better than I thought I was. Maybe she'd been right about that too. The mortgage had 22 years left on it, and my back ached more than it used to, and the world seemed to get a little crazier every day. But my family was together, and my grandchildren were healthy and happy, and sometimes in the evening when the light slanted through the kitchen windows just right, I could almost feel Martha smiling. That seemed like enough. More than enough, actually. That seemed like everything that really mattered.